Hey everyone, my name is Tim, and this is So You Want Me to Believe. I am finally back to making my regular episodes. I'm really sorry for the 3-week hiatus there. My computer finally decided to die on me, and I've been having trouble coming up with the funds to buy a new one. Also, I know this is a little bit ridiculous, but I started a GoFundMe to try and raise the money for a new laptop. I never really had a use for one until I started the podcast, but now I really need one, and I just don't know how I'll be able to come up with the money for one. So if you feel like helping out, I'll put a link to the page in the show notes, but no pressure, just thought I'd reach out for some help. Luckily, one of my friends was gracious enough to allow me to borrow his old laptop until I'm finally able to afford one of my own, so I'm hoping for no more delays. I swear, the universe just does not want me to have a podcast, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. But with that being said, I also want to thank you guys for understanding that this has been a hectic time for everyone, including myself. Working from home has been pretty stressful, as a lot of things I do for work are difficult to do remotely. For those of you who don't know, I work for a government agency for my day job, specifically working with insurance enrollment. And right now is a pretty busy time for us on a regular day, as it's one of 2 open enrollment periods, and this is usually stressful enough on its own, but trying to manage it all remotely while also losing 2 of our team members has been quite a challenge and pretty mentally exhausting. So while I will make every attempt to continue posting regular updates, please bear with me. If I make a post late or miss a week entirely, I will apologize now. Remember, this is just a hobby for me, and while I love putting out the show and interacting with you guys, my mental health comes first. I also don't want to burn myself out on producing the show. I want it to keep being fun. On another note, if you follow me on social media, you might remember that I had promoted an episode that, without giving too much information away, looked like it involved a case from an earlier decade. This was a cult-based episode, and it's a really pretty interesting story, but I've decided that I want to shelve that one for a different day. Instead, I'm giving you guys this episode to discuss an outrageous conspiracy theory that's been circulating online in the past week or so. I'll talk about it more in the main part of the episode, but just keep an eye out for that culty episode as well. It's coming soon. I already have next week's episode mapped out, so it might be a couple of weeks, but I promise it's coming. If you don't already know, Patreon is an online membership platform that provides business tools for creators to run a subscription content service. It allows subscribers or patrons to help creators to continue producing content while offering exclusive rewards and perks for their support. The link to my Patreon page is www.patreon.com/SYWMTBpod. There are 3 tiers, each with their own set of incentives. If you'd like to check those out, follow that link to the page and they're listed there for you. If you do like the show, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. Everyone who subscribes not only gets exclusive content, but it goes a long way in helping me produce the show. Any support is greatly appreciated. I also want to plug Buzzsprout. I don't have enough of a listener base to get an actual sponsor, so to be clear, Buzzsprout is not sponsoring this show. But they are a great service that offers content creators affiliate partnerships, so I do want you to know about them. Buzzsprout is a podcast hosting service that allows creators to put the content they make out into the world. If you've ever been interested in starting your own podcast, like I'm doing now, Buzzsprout is an excellent resource to help you achieve that goal. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know I sent you, gets you a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan, and helps support the show. I use Buzzsprout, and it's really helped make putting out the podcast an easy task. Buzzsprout offers a lot of useful and convenient features, like tons of guides to help you find the right equipment at the right price, getting your show listed in every major podcast platform, and by providing a great-looking podcast website that includes audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners. The team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. So join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. For this week's Weird History Fact, I'm taking a slightly different approach. The historical fact I want to discuss is not weird in itself, but what is weird about it is that 100 years later, we've taken a pretty alarming step in the same direction without ever learning from our past mistakes. And while that seems to happen with some frequency anymore, this time it has become quite dangerous. So, without any further ado, I want to talk about the events that took place during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918 and 1919. A lot of the information I got for this segment came from a Time article written by Nancy Bristol, and a link to that article can be found in the show notes. This article mostly references occurrences that took place in San Francisco during that time. This is significant because the outbreak appears to have begun in the Boston area, so a 1918 San Francisco mindset would have been that it's unlikely to travel from the East Coast to the West Coast. Obviously, this turned into a worldwide crisis, so that did not end up being the case. But it was about 2 months before the outbreak reached San Francisco, and when it finally did, the city put orders in place for closures and for citizens to wear masks in public. And it seemed to be working. After a short time, when the infection rate started to decline, the city of San Francisco decided to relax some of their safety measures. Businesses were reopened, and people started socializing again. The city did still require the use of masks in public spaces, and for the most part, people were okay with it. Well, until they weren't. After a pretty short period of time, people began to grow tired of complying with the mask order. They had relaxed other areas, why not masks too? It became such an issue that arrests were made when people were found in public settings not wearing masks. According to the Time article, about 400 people were arrested in different hotel lobbies throughout the city in a single sweep. But after a while, even the city's government officials were seen not wearing masks in public, and soon any attempt to enforce the mask policy was abandoned. But that was a huge issue, because they relaxed these safety measures when they started seeing a decline, not when there were no new reported cases. And the problem there is that the safety measures were working, and that's why the infection rate was declining. But they relaxed them too soon, and a second wave of the Spanish flu overtook the city, and people resisted the pleas for citizens to put on their masks. People began going out to public debates on the issue, sometimes by the hundreds. Obviously, this within itself is an issue. If hundreds of people are gathered together, none of them wearing masks, doesn't that seem rather risky? The city didn't make anything official, and they didn't put any closures in place. And as a result, there were 600 new cases reported in a single day in January of 1919. In response to this, the city finally made it official and mandated that masks be worn in public again, but oddly enough, did not attempt to make any public closures as it did the first time around. But not only was this too little too late, but a majority of people hated the idea of complying with these safety protocols. They formed a group called the Anti-Mask League, and masks were so unpopular that it became impossible to enforce. By the end of the pandemic, 45,000 citizens of San Francisco would become infected with the Spanish flu. And of those 45,000, 3,000 would die. Now, it's important to note that the views expressed by the citizens of San Francisco may have made up a majority of that city, but that margin was not mirrored nationally. There were pockets across the country of people who had the same mindset, but overall, most Americans did not see things the way San Francisco citizens did, and complied with the safety protocols put in place by their governments. We seem to be experiencing a time right now where these sentiments are being repeated in the wake of the current pandemic. There are several reports of protesters storming their state capitals demanding action. And while these protests are largely focused on the closures and stay-at-home orders put in place, it's clear that people are growing tired of the masks as well. Not only that, but because of the protests and the fear of economic collapse, many states are moving towards reopening. The problem here is that a majority of Americans, once again, do not agree that the closures are unnecessary and are willing to wear the masks in public. And a large majority of Americans are concerned that states are moving too quickly to attempt to reopen. The moral of the story is that we really need to learn from past mistakes. I understand the economic concerns, but I think the anger is focused in the wrong area. That's all I want to say about that, but if the story about San Francisco tells us anything, moving too quickly can cost lives. For this week's podcast recommendation, I want to plug the Wild and Woke podcast. This podcast is hosted by Caroline and Ariana and brings you content similar to mine. So if you like my show and you want to hear more interesting stories, but where the hosts are not only informed but also honestly pretty hilarious, this show is definitely for you. Here's a short clip of their most recent episode.
Everyone was worried about heavy metal rock music and relations to like teenagers worshiping the devil and stuff like that. A wild time.
Damn.
Everybody was doing coke.
Basically.
So Tallahassee is all happened in Tallahassee, Florida too.
Oh my god, of course you fucking did. Anyways,
in
continue.
Florida.
Shit.
So a Tallahassee woman called the police in 1987 on two men who were in the park with 6 odd-looking children. Like these Two men were really well dressed, and that was super odd given the fact that they were driving around in a crappy old white van with 6 unkept and malnourished children. So, I mean, like...
If you liked what you heard in that clip, please make sure to give them a listen. I have put their link tree in the show notes. Again, that's the Wild and Woke podcast. Check them out. For this week's topic, I want to talk about the 22-minute video that has been circulating around the internet in the last week or so, where a disgraced virologist by the name of Judy Mikovits makes several wild claims about her experiences with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and its current director, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Those claims involve matters dealing with her own life, as well as how Dr. Fauci is handling and possibly even profiting off of the current COVID-19 pandemic. This semi-short video is just a teaser of a full documentary called Plandemic, set to be released in the summer of 2020, according to their website. But before I dive into the claims being made here, let's talk a little bit about the other figure that we see in the video, the person asking the questions while looking on pained and woeful. His name is Mickey Willis. You've probably never heard of him before, but Mickey is the founder of a production company called Elevate, which he founded shortly after 9/11. In doing so, he shared his experiences on 9/11 as someone who observed the attacks from afar, not a firefighter, not a victim, but a civilian who claims to have rushed to the aid of those at Ground Zero and witnessed the atrocities firsthand. You could say that he's used his platform to spread awareness of the devastation of that fateful day using a first-hand point of view that most just wouldn't understand because they haven't lived it. But I like to think of it as bastardizing the narrative of a tragedy in order to profit from the horrific death of thousands of people, but tomato tomato. Mickey has also produced other films, such as a documentary entitled Michael Bernard Beckwith, Spiritual Liberation, Fulfilling Your Soul's Potential. This film, while not rated and lacking in reviews, has a description that literally reads, "For more than 20 years, Michael Bernard Beckwith has provided spiritual guidance with the Agape International Spiritual Center, an unconventional church that incorporates various faiths and welcomes everyone warmly." Now, I have not seen this movie, nor do I have any interest in doing so. But if you know anything about the Agape International Spiritual Center, it's essentially a megachurch right outside of Los Angeles and is a sort of New Age take on Christianity. However, while I'm not accusing Mr. Beckwith of anything here, there are many concerns floating around about this spiritual center and whether or not it should actually be classified as a cult. But this episode isn't meant to focus around the Agape International Spiritual Center. If you'd like more information about that, there's plenty of information found online. But I do bring it up because I want to make it clear the kind of films this man makes. They aren't meant to be educational or even truthful. They're intended to be machines to earn a profit by generating ideas that sound logical and exciting. And they are, on the surface. And while I can't speak too much to the Beckwith film, I can tell you that the ideas in the short Plandemic film do not stand up to scrutiny. That's all I really have to say about Mickey Willis. I don't find him to be very important to the story, other than to explain to you what type of person we're dealing with that would put out a video like this. He may appear to be exposing corruption for the good of all people, but is he? Or is he simply trying to profit off of people's fears during a global pandemic? Now, let's talk a little bit about Judy Mikovits, the star of the film. In the video, Mykovits is described as one of the most accomplished scientists of her generation. This is really not a true statement, and I'll talk about why that is in just a bit. A little background on Judy Mikovits, though, first. Mykovits earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia in 1980, and then earned a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from George Washington University in 1992. It appears that Mykovits has been the center of controversy from the start of her career, beginning in 1987, when she worked as a lab tech for a company called Upjohn Pharmaceuticals in Kalamazoo, Michigan. With the news of Plandemic, it's becoming increasingly difficult to find information about Judy Mikovits that doesn't revolve around the film, so I'm not exactly sure what the issue was here, but it appears she quote-unquote departed the company after a dispute involving their bovine growth hormone. Now, I'm not sure if departed means she voluntarily left or if she was asked to resign or let go. But what Mykovits is most known for is her anti-vaccination activism, or for her research on chronic fatigue syndrome that she published, but was later retracted and repeatedly discredited as factual. She is, in fact, one of the favorite scientists to quote when those who believe in junk science need to back up their arguments. She has co-authored 2 books, one about her research on chronic fatigue syndrome and the corruption and greed that caused her work to become discredited, and the second appears to be the book form of Plandemic and was just released this year. Mykovitz has also been at the center of a controversy involving the theft of intellectual property, for which she was arrested and imprisoned. She discusses this a bit in the video, so I'll dive more into that shortly. So then, let me talk a little bit about the video itself. As I mentioned, the video is about 26 minutes long and is just a short preview of the upcoming full-length documentary. Mykovitz makes several accusations in this video, all of which make her out to be a victim of the corruption that exists in the scientific community today, brought on by the leaders of top organizations, which includes Dr. Anthony Fauci. If you're familiar with that name but can't seem to place it, Dr. Fauci is one of the top officials heading up the coronavirus task force, but has also served as an advisor under 6 different presidents. The overall picture Mykovitz is trying to paint here is that Dr. Fauci can't be trusted, and that he likely had a role in creating the virus, releasing it into the world, and plans to profit off of it by patenting a vaccine. She also claims that he incentivized not prescribing the medication that would be the most effective at treating the virus, hydroxychloroquine, in an effort to push an ineffective vaccine for which he has patents, resulting in the deaths of thousands of people who were purposefully mistreated. On the surface, these accusations are alarming and logical, and thus they have manipulated people all over the country into believing that they are true. And in an attempt to combat the spread of this misinformation, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other sites have taken action in removing the video from their platforms, while several media outlets released their own articles to fact-check her claims. But the filmmakers didn't stop there. They knew this would happen, and they knew that they could use that to their advantage. In the video, they claim that those of us who don't believe this conspiracy is taking place have been brainwashed into doing the dirty work for these bad guys, and that those in control will do everything they can to silence them. So when these platforms remove the videos, even if it was an attempt to stop the spread of misinformation, the filmmakers twisted that to make it look like censorship, and the conspiracy theorists are eating it up. Now, normally, I find conspiracy theories to be fun and thought-provoking. I've released a couple of episodes on different conspiracy theories, and I like to leave them pretty open-ended in order for you to make your own decisions. But I can't do that this time around. The information Mykovitz puts forward in this video is dangerous and could cost people their lives. So if you haven't gathered this by now, I'm here to talk about why the accusations in the video are false and why you should completely disregard what these people say. So let's go through her accusations one by one. The first of many involves her arrest following her termination from the Whitmore-Peterson Institute, where Mykovitz was leading a team researching chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. Mykovitz claims that she was arrested without any charges and that her house was searched without any warrants. She says they literally just drug her out of her house while a video plays of what looks like a SWAT team raid taking place. I'm not sure what this footage actually relates to, but we can be fairly certain it is stock footage that has nothing to do with Mykovitz's arrest. Because the fact of the matter is, Mykovitz was arrested on 2 separate charges filed by the district attorney in Washoe County, Nevada: possession of stolen property and unlawful taking of computer data, equipment, supplies, or other computer-related property. This was the result of a civil suit filed by her previous employer. And not only that, but she wasn't even at home when she was arrested. Another WPI employee by the name of Max Fost, who is another central character in this story, says that Mykovitz was hiding out on a boat and was arrested as a fugitive in California, where she was held in jail for several days before being released following an arraignment and posting $100,000 in bail. She then surrendered to the police in Reno, Nevada, and returned some of the notebooks taken from WPI. Now, she claims these items were planted in her home, but Max Fost tells a different story. He considered himself a subordinate of Mykovitz during their time at WPI, and he claims that he took the notebooks and other items from the lab under Mykovitz's direction. And she was, in fact, in possession of the items when she was arrested. So the idea that she is innocent in all of this and is some kind of pseudo-murder for telling the truth of this huge corruption scandal is just a bald-faced lie. If you look into the case, the charges were eventually dropped due to a deal made with WPI. But drop charges does not mean no charges. It means there were legitimate charges against you, and you worked out a deal to have them dropped. But that's just the first of several claims Mykovitz makes in the video. The overall point of the video is to basically try and discredit anything Dr. Fauci has said in regards to COVID-19, and to paint him and a few other prominent scientists as corrupt, money-hungry villains who would rather turn a profit and watch people die than to actually help people. Now, the first major problem I have here is that Mykovitz is 1 in a million, meaning that there are scientists all over the place. But no other scientist is making claims like these against Dr. Fauci or his colleagues. Why is that? Could it be because this is absolutely just not true? The whole thing is pretty complicated and goes back several years. Her claims against Dr. Fauci originate from the 80s when there was intensive research going on into the treatment and isolation of HIV. According to Mykovits, a virologist by the name of Luc Montagnier had originally isolated the virus and wrote a paper about it. But when Dr. Fauci learned of the paper, he contacted Mykovits to get a hold of it, and she refused. She claims that Dr. Fauci held up the publication of Montagnier's paper while his colleague, Robert Gallo, wrote his own study to take all of the credit for the discovery that would allow him to profit from patents on treatments. She claims that the delay in publishing the paper, which would have spread the knowledge of effective treatment, caused millions of people to lose their lives. Now, this is quite the claim, and if true, Dr. Fauci would have to be criminally insane to justify earning a profit over saving millions of lives. But here's the problem. There is no evidence that Judy Mikovits worked on the team that isolated the HIV virus. Again, she's just making things up here. At the time of the discovery, Mykovits was a lab technician at the National Cancer Institute, and she hadn't received her PhD as of yet. According to a fact-checking article on Science Magazine's website, there were 4 landmark papers printed in their publication related to HIV research in 1984. And Mykovits did co-author a paper on HIV with one of her superiors by the name of Francis Russetti, who had already published his own paper on HIV the year prior. The joint project was not released until 1986, 2 years after Science Magazine published those 4 important papers. There is just absolutely no evidence that Dr. Fauci held up the publication of any case studies, or that a holdup resulted in the deaths of millions of people. It's just not true. There is at least one part of the story that is true here, though, and while I don't believe it's as big of a controversy as Judy Mykovits wants to make it, it is a little unsettling. Dr. Fauci does, in fact, have several patents on life-saving therapies. I'll post a link in the show notes if you want to check those out. This isn't necessarily a problem, and there's no way Dr. Fauci having these patents has led to millions of deaths. However, it does seem a little bit inappropriate to me that a life-saving therapy can be patented for profit. I somewhat understand the reasoning behind that. He helped produce it and deserves the credit for it, but patenting the treatments does feel a little exploitative. So that's what is mentioned in the video in regards to Mykovits' past with Dr. Fauci and her past issues with the scientific community. But this documentary isn't just being released now because, as she says, her gag order has been lifted. We're in the midst of an international pandemic, and Dr. Fauci is one of the top advisors on the coronavirus task force. Now that the average American knows who he is and recognizes his name, now would be the ideal time to release information to the public about him. No one would have known who he was or really cared a year ago. But now that you can't go to a news report on the virus without seeing his face, it's much easier to get people's attention. Mykovits goes on to make claims about Dr. Fauci and the coronavirus that she links to her accusations from the 80s, only this time it's even more sinister. Now, she claims that there is no possible way that the mutation of the coronavirus was naturally occurring and that it had to have been manipulated in a lab. She says she has knowledge of 4 labs working on something related to coronaviruses, and those are the North Carolina labs, Fort Detrick, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, and the Wuhan laboratory in China. But again, all of this information is just false. There is no evidence that the mutation of SARS-1 originated in any lab. And in fact, even though U.S. conservatives, including the president, continue to spin this theory that the pathogens that caused the coronavirus somehow escaped from the Wuhan lab, no one has been able to produce any evidence to support that theory. But not only that, but according to the Science article, scientific estimates suggest that the closest virus to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is a bat coronavirus identified by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Its distance in evolutionary is about 20 to 80 years. There is no evidence that this bat virus was manipulated. So Mykovits' claim that it would take 800 years for the virus to evolve on its own is completely false. Now, when I said that her claims here are more sinister before, it's not because of what she outright says. Mykovits never actually confirms that she believes the virus was released into the human population on purpose. In fact, she says she does not know whether it was on purpose or if it was an accident. But the implication of her claim says otherwise. What she's really trying to get across here is that Dr. Fauci knew about the studies being done on the coronavirus and was funding the lab in Wuhan, China through the NIAID. and it was under his supervision that the pathogens were released. Her implication is that Dr. Fauci orchestrated its release into the human population, risking the lives of every person in the entire world only to make money off of a vaccine that he could patent. I mean, come on. This is one of those things that sounds just crazy enough to be true, though, right? But there's literally no evidence of it. It's not true, it's just crazy. But people are still falling for it. Mykovitz then goes on to talk about the treatment options for COVID-19, as well as the safety measures put into place to help stop the spread of the virus. She says that Dr. Fauci and his team are now saying that you shouldn't use hydroxychloroquine, which is an existing drug used to treat malaria. She says that this is the only medication proven to work, hospitals are being incentivized not to use it, and that Dr. Fauci is doing this in order to push an ineffective vaccine at some point in the future from which he can earn a profit. She also claims that wearing masks and gloves is a bad idea and that closing beaches is a bad idea. Lots to unpack here. First, her claims about hydroxychloroquine are misleading. Yes, she is correct in saying that doctors are not recommended to use the drug to treat COVID-19. This is because, for one, it hasn't been tested and proven effective, and two, it has the potential to have very dangerous side effects. Scientists do not deny that the drug has the potential to treat the virus, and it's possible that it could. But use of the drug has been linked to potentially fatal cardiac side effects as well as suicidal behavior. And due to the extremely dangerous possible side effects of the drug, it is not wise or frankly ethical to prescribe the medication to patients, not truly knowing whether or not it would work. Also, as a side note, do we remember that the Kushners used to have a stake in a company who produced hydroxychloroquine? Panic buying ensued after Trump tweeted about it, and the demand for the drug skyrocketed. The Kushners have since sold their shares in that company after facing some backlash, but it does seem somewhat odd to me that Trump would accidentally tweet unconfirmed data about a drug his family could profit off of. But it would be totally unlike him to do something so unethical, right? He would never do anything like that, just like he would never funnel taxpayer money through a golf resort he owns by visiting it over 300 times in the last 3 years. That's not the point of this episode, though, so let me get back to the topic. Mykovitz also makes claims about social distancing being ineffective and says that wearing masks actually makes you sick. The video uses examples from doctors who use the argument used by anti-vaxxers the world over that you need bad germs to build up your immune system, and that by wearing masks and gloves, you're depriving your body of that bad bacteria it needs in order to keep you healthy. Therefore, when you finally are allowed to stop social distancing and get out of your house, everyone is just going to get sick. Not only that, but Mykovitz somehow suggests that closing beaches was a horrible mistake because there are, quote, sequences in the soil and the sand. You've got healing microbes in the ocean and the salt water. My absolute favorite response to this claim is, again, from that Science article. They say, it's not clear what Mykovitz means by sand or soil sequences. There is not evidence that microbes in the ocean can heal COVID-19 patients. Now, I'm pretty sure whoever wrote that was just being facetious because I don't think that's what Mykovitz meant by her statement. I think she probably just meant the same thing as the doctors they quoted. The bacteria important to the upkeep of your immune system is present on the beaches, but it is a rather humorous statement by the author of the article, so I thought I would include it here. Really though, social distancing works because it prevents unnecessary contact between individuals and lowers the risk of transmitting the virus. It is true that isolation can weaken your immune system, but in this instance, the risk of contracting a deadly disease with a healthy immune system outweighs the risk of staying home and slightly weakening your immune system. Yes, you may get a cold when you're done quarantining, but you probably won't catch a deadly virus. And as for the masks, Mykovitz claims that wearing a mask activates your own viruses. Everyone has been exposed to some sort of coronavirus in their lifetime. That much is true. But Mykovitz is claiming that by wearing a mask, you are reactivating your own viruses, which in turn will just make you sick. But this is utter nonsense. There is literally no evidence that wearing a mask will make you sick. This is just more junk science that people need to disregard. Masks may be an inconvenience for some, especially those of us who wear glasses and like to breathe and see at the same time, but they're necessary to help control the spread of the virus. So those are the points I want to cover in this week's episode. There are other claims Mykovitz makes in this video that I didn't cover, and there's a full-length movie full of junk coming that I'm sure will be just as outlandish. Honestly, if you believe any of the claims this woman has made, you haven't done the research. But the big question I have with this is why does she continue to do what she's doing and spread misinformation? Well, I can't answer that with any level of certainty, but I do have my theory. and that is that she is embarrassed and refuses to accept her defeat. When Mykovitz published her paper in 2009 about CFS and its link to the XMRV virus, this was groundbreaking research because there was little to no knowledge about the causes of CFS and what treatment could be used to treat it. So when her paper was discredited and it was discovered that her testing had been compromised and her findings may have stretched the truth, she was viewed as somewhat of a sham in the scientific community. And ever since, she has been trying to legitimize those findings by making accusations against other scientists. Well, it wasn't really my fault, look at what these guys are doing. It's her entire source of income at this point. I believe that she was embarrassed by her failures in her research and refuses to admit that mistakes were made because it gained so much attention. And instead of accepting that there were issues with the study, she insists that those in power just don't want you to know the truth. But the truth is, that's not the truth. At this point, I would normally ask what you think of the claims made in the Plandemic video. But to be completely honest, I don't feel that it's worth discussing because the claims Mykovitz puts forth are incredibly dangerous and absolutely should not be taken seriously. Wear your mask, practice social distancing, and if you or a loved one are suffering from COVID-19, you are in my thoughts and I hope you recover quickly. If you like this episode, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the show notes. You can also follow me on social media. You can like me on Facebook. The page is So You Want Me to Believe Podcast. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is @SYWMTBpod on both platforms. If you have any suggestions for future show topics, or if you want to discuss any of my other episodes, you can also send me an email at sywmtbpod@gmail.com. If you did like the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Good ratings and reviews help others find the show, and they just make me feel good inside. And if you didn't like the show, honestly, I'm okay with that. I don't really need to hear about it, but I appreciate you sticking around until the end. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all again next week.